Welcome those of you who have woken up on the West Coast at 9 o'clock and those on the East Coast at 12 o'clock and wherever else you are. Um, I look for those faces familiar, and I am very honored today to have Yossi Alpher from just outside of Tel Aviv in Israel, from his garden home, addressing us and trying to edify us about the situation in Israel. And I'm sure that Yossi will also open up for some implications for the broader Middle East and Israel's role in it. And a little bit of background, besides perhaps some of the information you've seen. Yossi has been one of the most sought after analysts with a very strong security background. He was in the Mossad, an Israeli intelligence organization, and spent a lot of time in different places in the Middle East. He carved out a brilliant career in the think tanks, probably the leading Israeli think tank, particularly on security policy questions, the INSS, had a predecessor that Yossi was the director of. He's also a very notable author. He has two very recent books that we can actually put on our website, at least title and contact information where you might get them. He has been very active in the American context as well. He was very active in running organizations that were associated with American Jewish organizations, and his trending line has always been, I would say, security dovish in Israel, and has access to information that very, very few people have. And I think Yossi, without further ado, we introduce you, and he has now at least 5 times spoken with cohorts of Ibrahim students that were in the Middle East and in Israel. And each and every one of those times, they were really fascinating conversations, and we walked away with an introduction to somebody who really can help us understand and comprehend the complexity. And Yossi, thank you for being with us. And go ahead and give us, at the end of the day, at least some hope without delusion.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and it's nice to be with you all. Thank you for the warm and overly nice introduction, but I'll try to live up to it. I'll try to speak for 20 minutes, somewhere between 20 minutes and half an hour, no more than that, to give you plenty of time for questions and comments. So I'm going to go over a great deal of material of geostrategic space, almost in outline form, and depending on you folks to find what interests you and to latch on to that with your questions and comments. Let me begin with the title that has been given to this talk, the impossibility, in parentheses, of a two-state solution. And I would suggest, with all due respect, that this title is woefully out of date. There is no two-state solution on the agenda, not on the Israeli agenda, not on the Palestinian agenda, not on the West Bank agenda, not on the Hamas-Gaza agenda, not on the broader Arab agenda. So possibility, impossibility, don't seem particularly relevant. What is happening, with or without an agenda, is that we and the Palestinians are sliding down a slippery slope towards some sort of one-state reality that will be on a spectrum somewhere between democratic and apartheid. Who knows where? Who knows how long that will take? And the Arab world doesn't really care. The main thing is not to rock the vote, especially now, which is why we saw for instance, the strong Palestinian and particularly Jordanian reaction, and even Gulf reaction to the the Trump plan and the so-called annexation initiative, because it's rocking the boat. And that's the last thing people need now in the Middle East, or for that matter in the world, when everybody's preoccupation is with the coronavirus. So I don't know what title. The title I'd give this talk is Israel and the Corona Chaos. Probably describes best what I have to say. And now here I'm on a role play. I'm going to be Bibi, and I'm going to tell you what's on my mind. Bibi, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, what's preoccupying me right now, and what is on my mind. And I'll get out of that role at a certain point and go back and try to sum up things on a broader basis. But I think this will give you a better idea of where Israel is. What's on my agenda? First and foremost, I've got a corruption trial. There was a trial hearing today, and it's set January to begin for the prosecution to present its claims and its witnesses, meeting 3 times a week, which means that the 3 judges intend to make this a fairly quick trial, not one that's going to last for years, as I would hope to string it out. But I've got smart lawyers, and I'm depending on them to try to delay as long as possible. I've delayed very successfully until now. Secondly, I've got not one corona on my agenda. I've got 3 coronas. I've got the pandemic, the virus, COVID-19. I've got an economic corona because the economy is in a total shambles. 1 million people unemployed or furloughed. The national debt goes skyrocketing with all the money we have to spend to try to keep people somehow above the waterline. And I've got a leadership corona because for the first time in many, many years, my approval ratings are dropping day by day. And people no longer have confidence in my ability to lead. I've lost my credibility with all 3 coronas. And I'm panicking. Quite frankly, I'm panicking, and I'm doing things that panicky people do. I created an impossible coalition with the blue-white opposition just to try to survive without another election. But we have 35 ministers, and we can't manage anything, and we can't agree on anything. Luckily, I have my own right nationalist, messianic, religious bloc still behind me, still blindly supporting me, but even there is attrition that worries me. I'm so panicked that I'm not just blaming I'm no longer blaming the opposition for the virus, for the economic situation. I'm blaming civil servants. I'm singling out civil servants in the Treasury Ministry and elsewhere and saying they're to blame for all of this, and nobody believes me. I'm blaming my fellow Likudniks, which is a very dangerous thing to do because I'm liable at some point to lose their support. I'm under tremendous pressure to appoint a corona czar, that is, a single person brought in from the outside who will coordinate between the health ministry, the finance ministry, the Ministry of Internal Security, the army and the Shin Bet that have done all kinds of tasks here, even the Mossad. And why am I pressured to do this? Because I thought this was my job, but people are saying I didn't do it well. So I'm under pressure, and I don't want to appoint a corona czar because he'll steal all of the glory from me. He's liable to do it. Apparently, he'll be able to do it better than I can do it. I have a corona cabinet, a sort of smaller version of the national cabinet, where we can't agree on anything. So we're making decisions in the morning and reversing them in the evening and reversing them the next morning. As matters stand right now, on Tuesday, we're closing the restaurants. Why are we closing them only on Tuesday? Because we tried to close them on Friday, but the restaurateurs sent a lobby to me saying, no, but we've stocked up with food. Let us at least feed people for another 4 days before you close us down. But I know what's going to happen. On Tuesday morning, they're going to lobby me to leave the restaurants open for another few days. And the public is listening all the time and waiting to hear, are restaurants open? Are restaurants closed? Are swimming pools open? Are they closed? Is the beach open? Is it closed? Etc., etc., etc. This is my day. There's a growing phenomenon of both legal and illegal demonstrations, some of them violent, protesting my leadership, protesting corruption, protesting poverty, protesting the lockdowns that I'm threatening to do. And some of these demonstrations are getting out of hand, and a lot of them are calling for me to step aside and deal with my corruption accusations and let somebody else lead. And that makes me panic as well. I'm looking at strikes in the most vital sectors. The nurses want to go on strike. The social workers, whom we need to take care of, all the people who are being, more and more of them are being made miserable from day to day, economically, socially, locked up. The social workers are going on strike as well. They all want more money. If I give them more money, I know there are going to be more demands for more and more and more people money, and we're going to run out. A few statistics as of Sunday, today, out of just over 9 million Israelis, we had around 1,700 new confirmed carriers a day, of which we have a total of around 400 medium, serious, and on ventilators people. Since January, we have 400 dead. Now, those are not terribly, for you guys, those are not terribly impressive figures at all. And we have a whole lobby of people who say, stop panicking. Things aren't so bad. 1,700 people a day, but most of them don't even know they're sick. Just deal with the old people like your faithful servant. Shut them up in homes and deal with them. But let the rest of us get on with life. And then we have another lobby of doctors who say that if I don't lock down the economy now, today, in 3 weeks, we'll have a national catastrophe. And all of these are serious people, and I don't know how to deal with them. This is what's on our agenda. This is what's on our mind. What have I done? What did I do last week to try to somehow shut everybody up? I just went on primetime TV and I said, we're going to hand out money to everybody. Everybody's going to get some money. You, Yossi Alpher, you'll get 750 shekels. Your wife will get 750 shekels. Your kids will get them. And if they have kids, they'll get more. We're just going to hand out money, which is against every principle of every serious economist, just in the hopes that if we sort of shower the public with money from a helicopter, the public will shut up and stop pestering and decrying my loss of leadership capability. Now you folks ask, wait a minute, wasn't annexation on your agenda, Bibi? It was briefly, but nobody talks about it anymore. It was briefly, I mean, we had a July 1st deadline, which I managed to ignore. Another, what are we, almost 3 weeks have gone by since then. And nobody's talking about annexation anymore. I had hoped to exploit Trump's largesse with his peace plan and to get his public blessing for annexing up to 30% of the West Bank. And I saw this as my legacy. Whatever happens in my corruption trial, I'm 71, I won't live forever. Whatever happens, this will be the legacy I leave the people of Israel, a much bigger chunk of the West Bank, something which shrinks any conceivable Palestinian entity to meaningless. And This is what I had plotted with Trump and with Jared Kushner. This is what I had planned. And I was defeated. I was defeated by Trump himself, who for his own domestic reasons apparently refused to openly endorse this to the Israeli public, something I needed. I was defeated by Gantz, my alternate prime minister, my partner in this weird national unity rescue government that we set up. Gantz managed to go to some Americans, including Kushner, and say, don't endorse it, or tell Bibi you won't endorse it unless I endorse it. And Gantz won't endorse it. And so Gantz helped defeat me. And I was defeated by threats from Jordan. They took this really seriously. And they threatened to tear up our peace agreement, to close the border. That would be a very negative part of my legacy. And they managed to go to other Arabs in the Gulf and get them to threaten me as well. I was defeated by threats of international sanctions, particularly from the Europeans. And Joe Biden sort of hinted at some sort of sanctions if and when he wins the elections. But most of all, I was defeated by the coronavirus because it simply took over the agenda and leaves no room for talk about proactive initiatives by me in coordination with the Americans. It simply left no room. And since the situation is getting worse day by day, more and more corona carriers, more and more seriously ill, more and more dead, it looks like with American elections approaching, it looks like that has fallen off the agenda, annexation, and it's certainly fallen off the consciousness of the Israeli public, political public, settler public. There are a few settlers that still think they can have some influence and make this happen. It doesn't look like it at this point. Let me conclude by comparing myself to your President, Donald Trump. Everybody knows we are good friends and we think alike on a lot of issues. And certainly we plotted this whole Trump peace plan and the annexation together for quite a while until it turned out we couldn't agree on everything. So let me just, again, completely off the record, compare myself to Trump. Only one of us is smart, well-read, and analytical. And I'll leave it for you to decide which one of us that is. But we're both right-wing, ultra-nationalist opportunists. We both have close and problematic family support of dubious ethical standing, which we are not always comfortable explaining. We agree on Iran. We do not agree on Russia, on China, or on the US role in the Middle East. Trump wants to pull out and we want the Americans to stay. This is a point of contention between us. Trump is at odds with China. We want to stay friendly with China. We have huge high-tech and business dealings with China that we don't want to see jeopardized. Russia is now our neighbor in Syria. It's our neighbor. And I meet with Putin more than any other leader in the world in order to coordinate Israel's ability to oppose Iran in Syria without getting in the way of the Russian presence and vice versa. And we succeed in this not badly. We both face at this point serious challenges to our leadership. Although I must say in the States, you have a challenger, Joe Biden, whom you can point to and listen to. Here, there's no challenger to me, Bibi, to speak of. The public is beginning to turn against me, but there's no one leading that public, which is it really helps me a great deal to manage with this. But Trump, if I had to say which one of us, I, Bibi, or Trump, is more popular in Israel today, it's Trump. It's Trump because he recognized United Jerusalem, because he gave us the Trump deal of the century, whereas I am in deep trouble because of the corona, the economic and leadership failures. I mentioned Benny Gantz, my alternate prime minister. He can be here and there. He has managed to thwart some of my initiatives like annexation, but basically he does not appear to be, in the eyes of the public, to be an alternative leader. He's basically quite silent. Indeed, the prospects for new elections, which I'm often accused of actually wanting to have a fourth round of elections in 2 years in order to exploit my popularity and get rid of Gantz and this partnership. Well, with my popularity dropping, I wouldn't dare to have new elections today. So I'm stuck with this totally unmanageable coalition and government, and I have to coexist with Gantz, which is just going to make my life hell. Finally, one word about Iran. I've mentioned it in the Syrian context. You probably have followed the news of a whole series of mysterious explosions in sensitive Iranian installations, some connected to their nuclear program. Who is behind this? If we had any role in it, we never say. And the US never says as well, but certainly it's fair to say there's close Israeli-American military cyber cooperation with regard to Iran. And then Iran has been hit by a series of serious blows in recent weeks that have set back its nuclear program. I think we've also managed well what we call the campaign between wars. The Hebrew is mabam, maracha ben milchamot, campaign between wars against Iran, mainly in Syria, to a lesser extent in Lebanon, and even lesser extent in Iraq. But the idea here, this is a quite separate enterprise from stopping the Iranian nuclear program. The idea here is to stop Iran from expanding its hegemonic influence in the Levant, Iraq, particularly Syria and Lebanon, with the very outspoken objective of being able to make war on Israel from a joint border, from a shared border. Iran is more than 1,000 kilometers away, but there are Iranian forces in Syria, there are Iranian proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is the campaign between wars that we have been waging quietly, fairly successfully, but it's by no means over. Trump's economic sanctions against Iran have not set it back from advancing these goals, particularly in Syria. And this is a huge worry for us on a day-by-day basis, and one we deal with regardless of the corona crisis. And I, Bibi, can say that I've managed to, with all my preoccupations, this has been managed fairly well. So much for Bibi. Let me sum up with a few more words and then open it up to your questions. What we're looking at today in Israel is a combination of failures of leadership and governance against the backdrop of the virus. The Palestinian issue, most other Middle East issues, with the exception of Iran, are completely overshadowed. And we know that most of our Arab neighbors, most of the time, are just as preoccupied as we are with the virus. Iran in particular, Qatar, Lebanon, which has its own huge economic crisis, in addition to the virus. But this is what's preoccupying all of us. We also know that our Arab neighbors, at least when we were succeeding back in April and May in stopping the virus, and quite spectacularly, they watched very closely what we did on a daily basis and mimicked our decisions. Do this with hospitals, do that with ventilators, so on and so forth. Well, I hope they're not mimicking our decisions anymore, because our decisions have been very bad in the last month or two. We're looking at growing public unrest, which is really quite unusual for Israel. It reminds some people of the period after the Yom Kippur War in the fall of 73, when there was a huge public uprising against the premiership of Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan as defense minister, which eventually forced them to resign. Bibi is not going to resign quite so readily, but he's certainly frightened by what he sees in the public. This brings up the possibility that with the corruption, once the corruption trial gets into high gear in January, and if he's still unable to, that's 6 months away, if he's still unable to control the health situation and the economic situation in Israel, he might seek an honorable exit with a plea deal. It's not something that's talked about now. It's not something that's characteristic of him. He is basically known to be scared to death to go to jail. He is scared to death to follow in the footsteps of Ehud Olmert, of Moshe Katsav, honorable Israelis who spent years in jail. And he is, he wants that get out of jail free card. And ultimately, if it concludes that what he needs is a plea deal to get that card, it could be conceivable, but only in around 6 months. I think it's more likely he'll hang on for years. He'll try to just slog through the trial. There'll be an appeals process. He can drag it on for many more years, maybe get himself elected president, which is not an operational job, but it would give him immunity come next June when we have presidential elections. But as matters stand, even with his popularity dropping, there's no obvious political alternative leader on the horizon. Finally, let me just offer one more word, since as you can see and hear, the total preoccupation here is with the virus. And here I'm speaking, Mark mentioned my background in intelligence. One of the things I did in the Mossad was, not the only thing, but one of them was as an intelligence analyst. And when I look at what the world is facing today, Israel, the United States, there are very few islands of tranquility that seem to get away without panicking over this virus. I would call this what in intelligence terms is a revolutionary situation. And in a revolutionary situation, a good analyst admits that he or she is incapable of predicting what's going to happen tomorrow, because the protagonists in a revolutionary situation don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So if they don't know, then how in the world could I possibly know? The best I can do in a revolutionary situation is describe accurately what's happening right now. And even here, we don't, you take two experts and put it on pandemics and put them in the room, and you get different descriptions. This virus is not predictable, and it has far-reaching political ramifications for countries and for relationships between countries that we're going to see a lot more of. Here in the Middle East, as I look around and try to say who is managing this crisis better, it's fascinating to note. And don't forget, the Corona crisis came in the Middle East on the heels of what was called the Arab Spring that broke out in 2011 with revolutions and civil wars in 6 different Arab countries. It's still going on in a number of them, in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen. The virus comes on top of all of this. And you look around, who managed to get through the Arab Spring unscathed, and who seems to be managing the virus in the Middle East? It's all kings, all monarchs. No other system of government appears to be capable of dealing with this very well. The sole exception I could point to is Hamas in Gaza, simply because they're locked up there. And if nobody comes in and comes out, they're going to have a lower virus rate, although that could change as well. But we have locked them out, and Egypt has locked them out. And so they have a low rate, but you can't say that's manageable because they also have a high poverty rate. The Arab monarchies are surviving this best. Even our neighbor Jordan, which is now they're about to reopen their tourist industry and their airports. And you compare to us just across the river, or to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and it's astounding, the contrast. Now, how you explain this is that in terms of people's readiness to follow orders from a monarch as opposed to some democratic republic, whether it's Egypt or elsewhere in North Africa or elsewhere in the Middle East, this is just food for thought for you. So we're looking at a severe leadership test in many places in the world. Israel is in the worst possible company today with countries like your own, the UK and Brazil, in all of whom leadership is failing spectacularly, and that has made a huge contribution to the health and the terrible health and economic situation, which preoccupies the leadership at the expense of just about everything else. That's it, folks, and be happy to hear your questions and comments.
Well, happy is hardly the word, but I think whoever would like to ask a question, I'd start just by asking one simple one. In the United States, we have had a very clear polarized battle between science in the public health sector in particular and the political sector with Trump and the non-science part of all of this. And there's a very dangerous dimension in the public that doesn't want to and doesn't believe that vaccinations do anything but kill their children. And so even if there's a specter of there being a save-all vaccination, America will have a serious problem on this, just like we'll have a serious problem probably on November the 3rd. No matter who wins the election, there might be violence. In Israel, do you have the same kind of phenomena taking place of a battle against the public health officials and the scientists that have been so erratic in predicting, blah, blah?
No, there's virtually no anti-science lobby here. The only problems we had initially were with ultra-Orthodox Jews concentrated in several communities near Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem and a few other places, whose rank and file take their marching orders from their rabbis. And some of the rabbis initially said, ignore this virus business. We're going to get together in a synagogue, under a roof with closed walls, elbow to elbow, and pray. That didn't last long because they had huge outbreaks in the beginning. In general, if you look at the overall statistics, a rather extraordinary percentage of Israelis who have had corona are from the ultra-Orthodox community. But this was resolved at a fairly early stage, and they became disciplined. It didn't help that one of their number, for political reasons, was the health minister in the previous government, and encouraged people to flout his own staff's directives. But we got over that, and we got through the first wave pretty well, despite this problem with the ultra-Orthodox. What we do have, though, is the scientific community, who are, they're the celebs today in Israel, and they're interviewed on the evening news, but they don't agree among themselves either. Just before we started this discussion at 6 o'clock, that is an hour and 40 minutes ago, I put on the news to bring myself up to date, and here they are interviewing a professor from the Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, who says, I'm directing my remarks to Bibi and to Benny Gantz. If you don't close down the entire economy right away, in 3 weeks, we will have a total health disaster. We'll be overwhelmed. We won't have enough ventilators. The hospitals will be overwhelmed. End of days prediction from this guy. Whereas you have other people of equally burnished reputations who are saying, look, 1,700 people get corona, are tested get corona a day. Most of them have no symptoms whatsoever. We just have to, wear masks and social distance and wash our hands, and we'll get through this. Don't close pools, people. You have no statistics that anybody got corona in a swimming pool. Don't close the beach. It's the healthiest place to be. Now, these are both scientific opinions from scientists of international reputation. I mean, one of Bibi's problems is, what do you choose from? Do you always go? His inclination has been lately to always go with the worst case scenario. But the worst case scenario from the scientists also is the worst case scenario from the economists. And so, I'm not telling you anything new. The only difference between us is, no, we don't have an anti-science lobby. Even the ultra-Orthodox have learned to respect science. We have lobbies for everything else. And the tendency, I think, here is increasingly to recognize that the bureaucrats in the health ministry, in the finance ministry, in the Ministry of Internal Security are failing. They're simply failing. And because this is a country that treasures its army and its security establishment, because they have seen us through all these wars, there is an inclination to say, let's put this in the hands of a general. And right now, again, 6 o'clock news, an hour, 40 minutes ago, there was a discussion about, well, finally, it looks like they're going to throw up their hands, Bibi and the rest of the Corona cabinet, and appoint a Corona czar. And then the question will be, what authorities does he get? And one candidate is a general. But another candidate is a doctor and a scientist who regularly appears on 8 o'clock news in the evening with the worst case scenarios for everybody and for everything, and the worst case prescriptions. Where we're going, we don't know. We go to sleep with having one list of steps that are going to be taken. You get up in the morning, put on the 7 o'clock news, because overnight they change their minds.
Other questions?
Hi, I have a question. Hi,
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alpher, for speaking to us. I'm actually right next to, I'm in Cyprus right now, so it's interesting to hear how our neighbors are handling things. But I wanted to ask you,
Cyprus is doing well.
Yes, we're all open, so I'm pretty happy.
Yeah. It's an island,
but
it helps.
Yeah, in relation, actually, since part of our land also has very strict borders, how much of an influence do you believe that the borders play in accessibility for hospitals in regards to Palestinian territories, which especially may overlap with Israeli land?
You're talking about access to hospitals? Did I hear you
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
From the beginning, Palestinian doctors were invited into Israeli hospitals to train on ventilators and the like, including very unusual step doctors from the Gaza Strip as well. Done quietly, but quite successfully. And ventilators and other equipment were provided, were delivered and provided. I haven't heard Palestinian complaints on that score. Where there are complaints is with regard to Palestinian day laborers who, because we're all at very close quarters, I mean, it's very similar to Cyprus with the Turks in the north, okay? You can cross the border in the morning, come back in the evening. A lot of Israeli construction workers and agricultural workers are Palestinian day laborers who commute from the West Bank and go home at night. Because we had, especially in the beginning, a much worse outbreak than in the West Bank, what happened was these day laborers brought the virus with them back home to the West Bank. And then you had the Palestinians saying quite accurately, you Israelis are sending us corona. So what solution was found? Well, the day laborers were confronted with only one option. You want to work, you're going to have to sleep in Israel. You're going to have to take 3 weeks at a time. You are working and sleeping in Israel. Then you go home for 2 weeks. And if you're clean of the virus, you come back for another 3. And so tens of thousands of Palestinian day laborers have been shuttling back and forth in this way for many months now. Now, the Gaza Strip, as I mentioned, there are almost, to my best of my knowledge, very few Gazans who enter Israel on a daily basis. Basically, just people who come to purchase food and goods for supply in Gaza, but not laborers. And Gaza's had a very low virus rate, simply because the Egyptians have closed the border and we have closed the border. What keeps them going is Qatar, which a special Qatari, I mean, this is, you got to live here to believe this nonsense, okay? A Qatari emissary with a suitcase of dollars every month goes from Jordan into Israel, into the Gaza Strip to deliver somewhere around $50 million for dollar payments as the Hamas authorities see fit to Gazans to keep the economy going. You might say that Bibi thinks he's actually learned from this something because he started showering us with shekels. Israel has 150,000 dollar millionaires. 150,000, that's mainly our high-tech sector, okay? They're getting 750 shekels each, according to this latest incredible decision. So some of them are donating it to charity, that's very nice. But I mean, this business of just showering people with cash is such an obvious expression of desperation. Vis-a-vis Gaza, it's desperation. We'll give you money, don't shoot rockets at us. Solve the problem? That's out of the question right now. We don't talk to one another. And Bibi vis-a-vis the Israeli public, here, I'm throwing cash at you, stop complaining. Those are the parallels.
Could I also ask, what is the situation with regards for those migrant workers for testing? Is that subsidized by the government or the Palestinian Authority like it is in the United States, or is that something that has to be paid out of pocket? I mean, how does that work to benefit both communities?
I don't know. I don't know how the testing is done in the Palestinian Authority. In Israel, it's all subsidized, and it's. I mean, I have 2 grandchildren who've been tested in recent weeks, both negative, and they were basically told you've been in contact with a carrier, go get tested. And within 2 days, they get the results. I just had myself, there's also a national program here, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, a serological test to see what percentage of the Israeli population have corona antibodies in their body. In other words, are we anywhere near herd immunity? And so they did like they do an opinion poll, and my name somehow came up. So I went and got tested for antibodies. None of this costs any money. The health services are basically heavily subsidized, and particularly at this time of Corona, they're subsidized. So it's not like in the States where you have to worry, should I go to the doctor because I can't pay. We don't have that problem at all here. We're much more we're much more similar to the Europeans. Incidentally, I have no antibodies whatsoever in my body. I'm totally negative, which is bad news, but what can I say?
I have a question. Let me first say, I heavily used bitter lemons for a thesis I wrote, so let me preface by saying thank you. It was very helpful. The second question I have, you mentioned the Arab Spring and how you pointed to the divide between republics and monarchies, and the aftermath of the Arab Spring basically resulted in stronger authoritarian tactics on both the monarchy side, and also the result was a stronger authoritarian grasp on the republic side. I'm specifically looking at Egypt post-revolution 1.0 and 2.0. I'm pointing to Syria. I'm pointing to a lot of other non-monarchies in the region. Do you see Israel falling into a similar divide, either going the way of the republics or the monarchies post-Corona, or is Israel in a separate category in terms of the authoritarian tendencies?
I would say that our present prime minister and his followers have authoritarian inclinations. They would, again, it's quite similar to the situation in the United States. They'd like very much to reduce the authority of the judicial establishment, to politicize appointments of judges, of the Justice Ministry, or of a police chief, for example. They've been trying for years, and they're still trying. And there are certainly members of, I mean, first of all, the ultra-Orthodox, as represented in the Knesset by their parties, they're not Democrats. There are no women in these parties. There are no women in. They take their orders from rabbis. But they've never had democratic tendencies. All they want is their piece of the pie, and they'll be quiet. They have no aspirations to tell the rest of us, most of the time, to tell the rest of us what to do. But in the mainstream, Israel today has to be characterized as the political mainstream is right nationalist religious, right nationalist religious. And all three of those have, in the eyes at least of liberal people like myself, and we're a minority today, they have these authoritarian tendencies, what is fascinating is our institutions, 71-year-old institutions like the judicial institutions, the courts and so forth, the police, were well enough built that they have managed to fend off most of these pressures. I mean, the fact is, the prime minister is on trial. Now, you don't see that in an authoritarian country. The prime minister is on trial on 3 counts. And he's been told that beginning in January, he's going to show up in court 3 times a week to hear the charges against him. He is, he's accused the attorney general of mutiny. He's accused the police chief who brought the evidence to the attorney general of mutiny. And he made all these accusations to the applause of his followers, and nothing happened. The establishment has survived all of this rather well. The armed forces have stayed not politicized. Totally not, to the extent, I'll just give you one more example. What you would call the Shin Bet, the National Security Service, the equivalent of the FBI, pioneered, going back 20 years, pioneered contact tracing, which is now a term I assume you're all familiar with, okay? It pioneered it in order to track down a suicide bomber or the people who sent a suicide bomber. If we go back to the second Intifada, 2000, 2005, we were hundreds of suicide bombers were attacking Israelis in Israel, and there were always cell phones involved. And so the Shin Bet pioneered contact tracing. Okay, along comes the coronavirus. Everybody has a cell phone, right? And if you are a carrier and you go into a grocery store, everybody you come in any contact with has a cell phone. So the government went to the Shin Bet and said, look, you can help us track down people who've been exposed to the virus so we can tell them to isolate for 2 weeks. And the Shin Bet's reaction was, don't get us involved in civilian issues. This is not good. This is not good for the national, for the status of the security establishment and the national setup of things. And they did it for a while successfully. And the minute they could, they begged out once we were over the first wave, and they said, we don't want to be involved in this anymore. This is not healthy. And it took Knesset legislation to force them, now with the second wave, which is worse than the first, to force them to come back in the picture and do contact tracing. And I find myself in contacts with non-Israelis, defending their contribution and explaining that no, Israelis are not worried that the Shin Bet is going to pull off a coup d'etat by listening into everybody's cell phones. By the way, if you think nobody's listening to your cell phone, you've got something to learn. I mean, cell phone traffic is wide open to everybody in every possible way. But to explain, don't worry, the Shin Bet is not going to take advantage of this in order to somehow infiltrate civil society. And it's not. And this is to their credit. So far, the brakes have worked, but there's still a lot of concern about authoritarian tendencies. As to our neighbors, look, the monarchs are no more authoritarian now than they were in the past, okay? It's not as if Egypt was a wide open liberal democracy under Mubarak, but I agree that Sisi is even far more authoritarian, long before the virus. I mean, his authoritarianism is directed primarily against the Muslim Brotherhood and against the Turks, Erdogan, who supports the Muslim Brotherhood and has now set up shop next door in Libya. These are the big Egyptian concerns. That and the Nile waters, the Ethiopian plan to begin filling the reservoir behind the Grand Renaissance Dam. You could see Egyptian military action any day in one or both of 2 directions. One, moving into eastern Libya to fortify the Western Libya forces. It's a whole tribal mess there. and to keep the Turks far away from Egypt, because the Turks already have thousands of troops in Libya, and the other somehow to send a military message to Ethiopia: don't fill that dam, because 108 million Egyptians are completely dependent on the waters of the Nile, and particularly of the Blue Nile. And this is a huge disaster that's just waiting to happen.
I have a question, if I'm not interrupting anyone. Well, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time. I really do appreciate you you taking the time to inform us about these issues. I have two questions, and they're particularly disparate, so I'll begin with the second one. I was particularly fond of, in the beginning of this Zoom call, in which you sort of assumed Benjamin Netanyahu's mind and sort of walked us through that whole ordeal. So I was curious if you could do the same thing with Benny Gantz, in the sense that he was willing to accept Israel's unity government with Benjamin Netanyahu in a sort of power rotation agreement. And I was confused with his agreement, because I believe he said that he would never serve under a prime minister under political corruption, as well as a majority of his supporters wanted to oust Benjamin Netanyahu. So if you could take me through that sort of thought process as to how he went and decided to serve under Netanyahu, because I guess I'm particularly confused with how he was willing to sort of, or rather, was he scared of cooperating with the Palestinian Israelis or the joint list parties in the Knesset, so much so that he sort of decided to forego his principles and make a deal with Netanyahu. And the second question I have is more so as a result of your personal experience with the Mossad. And did you run into any, or if you ran into any moral objections or moral reservations while working with the Mossad?
Let me start with the second. That's fascinating. Did I run into moral objections about
working
what I was asked to do?
Yeah, or the organization itself.
Look, I left the Mossad almost 40 years ago. Okay, so I can't speak for the Mossad today. I can speak for the spirit of the Mossad, if you like, and for what I understood. Yes, there was room for moral objections. If you know the history, after the attacks by Black September, which was the Fatah, Arafat's Fatah organization with a new name, which carried out, for instance, the Munich Olympic massacre. Israel went on the offensive in targeting Palestinians who were involved in those attacks, targeting them all over Europe. There was one in Cyprus or whatever, Italy. And I remember going to some very senior official and saying to him, hey, I want to know, how do we decide whom to target? Who makes these decisions? And I got a very detailed explanation of a court, an actual court, secret, but which had been set up to make the decisions so that everybody's conscience would be quiet. It was a convincing explanation, certainly convinced me. So yes, there is room for this. Now let's get to Mr. Gantz. All right, first of all, you in passing mentioned the Joint Arab List and the fact that Gantz refused to cooperate with them in trying to set up an alternative coalition. One of the fascinating dynamics of the past 2 years of Israeli repeat elections is the coalescing of this coalition of Arab citizens of Israel from 4 different parties into a cohesive political movement, which today has 15 members of Knesset, and which is beginning to be able to attract Jewish voters who are so fed up with the system that they understand it has to be shaken up. And some of the leaders of the Joint Arab List are extremely impressive politicians. sadly, at least one of the parties in them, Balad, is a pro-terrorist, semi-fascistic party. The fact that they all get along together, more power to them. It makes it harder for some Jews to support them, but they have become, they certainly present, for the first time in 70 years, the potential of a serious a political input by the Arab citizens of Israel. How this will play out in future elections, I don't know. Eventually, they're going to be in a coalition. I mean, it's clear we're moving in this direction. And that's good news. That's very good news in the terms of the integration. I mean, the Israeli Arab citizens are increasingly integrated into Israeli life, particularly economic life, academic life. All the doctors, the pharmacists, the builders, the cable TV is in the hands of Israeli Arab executives. They're doing very well economically, and this has to find its expression in the political dynamic of Israel as well. The sooner the better, from my standpoint. But it will come. Now, Gantz was not against this. He was not against working with them, but he put together his own party. Blue-White, as originally constituted, was a coalition of a variety of leftists and rightists. And all it needed was for 2 or 3 of the right-wingers, who were basically Likudniks who were fed up with Bibi, to say, no, we will not stay in this party if you were to enter a coalition with the Arab list. For Gantz to say, no, I can't do it. Now, why did he opt to throw in his lot with Bibi? You know, it's a question we'll be better able to answer in a few months. If, as so many observers predict, Bibi finds an excuse to dump Gantz and opt for new elections, then Gantz will really look like the fool that so many people accuse him of being. If, on the other hand, with the help of Corona, which was not part of his game plan, I assume, but if, on the other hand, we muddle through all the way to September 21, and Gantz actually becomes prime minister, he will be able to say, I did the right thing. I got rid of Netanyahu as prime minister, something nobody else could do. I did it by swallowing my pride and by violating every campaign promise I made. Okay? But the alternative was another round of elections, a 4th round, which Bibi, according to the polls then, the pre-Corona polls, which Bibi would have won handily. He would have had a right religious coalition without Gantz. And so Gantz agreed to this. And he tried to extract from Bibi a coalition agreement with enough safety measures in it that Bibi can't wiggle out. And he can't pull a fast one on Gantz. And whether that, so far it's held. There are huge tensions between the two. But one of the interesting characteristics of Gantz is how silent he is. He very rarely criticizes Bibi and the direction we're going. Occasionally he does. He made it plain that he was against annexation, for example. He sent his emissaries to Washington, and they had an effect. He helped stop the annexation without saying a word in public. So he's a real riddle. He's a real riddle, and in the eyes of most people, he's a wimp. But let's wait and see what happens. If for whatever reasons there are no elections and the trial of Bibi's trial proceeds, Gantz will gain strength. And by the way, if for any reason Bibi resigns, Gantz immediately becomes prime minister. So, you know, were these sound tactical considerations, or are Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi, who's the foreign minister now, both ex-chiefs of staff, Are they total political novices who were totally bamboozled by Bibi, who knows how to bamboozle political veterans, much less novices? These are two totally opposite, contrary descriptions of the reality we're in today. Which one is going to pan out and be right? I don't know. But Gantz made it plain. He's giving up on all his campaign promises because it seemed more important to set up an emergency government to fight Corona and to avoid a fourth round of elections. Well, so far he's avoided a fourth round of elections. He has not fought Corona very well. And that will be held against him, not as well as Bibi, although it's primarily Bibi, because Bibi's the one who's the prime minister and who goes on primetime TV to shower shekels upon us.
It seems, Yossi, like uncertainty is the name of the day, like the order of the day, name of the game, both on both sides of the Atlantic. So thank you so much for such a great talk. Would it be okay? Can we get your permission, Yossi, if any of our students would like to get in contact with you to share your email?
No problem at all. We'll be happy to try to answer them.
Fantastic.
And look for I do a weekly Q&A every Monday for Americans for Peace Now. It's on their website, peacenow.org. Some of what we just talked about was a dry run for me for the Q&A I'm writing tomorrow, for which I thank you all. But I do this every week and pick some angle to look at things. So take a look there as well. But if you have any specific insights or questions, I'd be happy to hear them.
You make a better Bibi than Bibi.
So for anyone that wants,
you make a better Bibi than Bibi.
I know the guy. I know the guy. I can impersonate him.
For anyone that wants that link, I believe it should be in the email that most of you received. But you can also find it just by quick Google search, APN Yossi Alpher, and you'll be able to see the backlog of the archives of kind of what he's written. It's wonderful. I follow it every week, and I've always enjoyed your analysis. So thank you so much for joining us here today.
Great to meet you all.
Stay
well. Stay healthy.